Hi, welcome everybody to Solid Rock, where we stress test the Gospels. My name is Mate de Brossi, and I shall be interviewing my friend and neighbor, Peter Murphy, ex-neighbor. We have already dealt with the literary nature or genre of the Gospels. We concluded that they are historically reliable. They are biographies of Jesus written in the Greek and Roman style of the times, and they are based on eyewitness testimony. And so today, Peter, we're going back to the historical reliability of the Gospel according to John. We already described the method we use in previous podcast. So, who wrote the Gospel according to John? I guess we start, as usual, with the internal evidence.
Yes, the Gospel according to John was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's chapter 21, verse 20 and 24. Sometimes shortened to the beloved disciples. He testifies to these things and he wrote them down. That's 21:24 again. He dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, he writes in chapter 1, verse 14. It's not an exhaustive biography of Jesus because the writer himself says there was much, much more. That's chapter 20, verse 30, chapter 21, verse 25. We also know that he wrote his gospel that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Chapter 20, verse 31.
Okay. What other internal evidence is there? Is there any inclusio evidence?
Yes, there is. The inclusio evidence in John's gospel is subtle and double. The first two disciples mentioned are anonymous to begin with, but as we read on, we learn that one of them is Andrew. The other one remains nameless, and it is not difficult to see the disciple whom Jesus loved behind this anonymity. Then, after Andrew, the next disciple mentioned is Simon Peter in chapter 1, verse 40. Similarly, at the end of the gospel, the last disciple mentioned is the disciple whom Jesus loved, just after Peter in chapter 21, verse 19. So we have a double inclusio, with the disciple whom Jesus loved taking priority over Peter. In other words, although the former insists that he wrote the gospel and that his witness takes priority, he nevertheless admits his indebtedness to the testimony of Peter. The language points to the author being a Jew from Palestine who had also lived in Asia Minor.
But who was the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple?
After the anonymity of chapter 1, verse 37, we first meet him at the Last Supper, chapter 13:23, where he was inclining next to Jesus. He was at the foot of the cross in chapter 19. He was present at the empty tomb, outrunning Peter in chapter 20. Finally, he was present in chapter 21, where we learn that he is the author of the gospel. There are basically two views concerning his identity. The traditional view is that he was John, the son of Zebedee, but that he avoids using his name, substituting the disciple whom Jesus loved, as a literary device to emphasize Jesus' love for him and, by extension, Jesus' love for each one of us. The other is that he was not a member of the 12, but from a priestly family in Jerusalem, which had given him access to the high priest's courtyard in chapter 18, verse 16. However, this view depends really on the interpretation of certain strands of external evidence, and personally I think it's rather dubious.
Right. So what is the argument for him being John, the son of Zebedee?
Basically, the argument goes like this. We know that the beloved disciple was present at the Last Supper. That's chapter 13, verse 23, which makes him one of the 12. Jesus, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, seems to have had an inner circle of three: Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So it seems logical to suppose that the disciple whom Jesus loved is one of these three. The beloved disciple is constantly distinguished from Peter, although their relation is close. He is one of the 7 disciples who go fishing in chapter 21, but he is not Peter, nor Thomas, or Nathanael, because these are named in the text. He is therefore either a son of Zebedee or one of the 2 unnamed disciples. He cannot be James, the son of Zebedee, who was martyred in AD 44. That's in Acts 12, verses 1 to 2. Because the beloved disciple lived long enough to lead people to suppose that he would not die. Chapter 21, verse 23. So we conclude that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John, the son of Zebedee. And we may further comment, and this is quite important really, that if the beloved disciple is not John, the son of Zebedee, then his anonymity in the gospel, and that of his brother James, is most odd. If it is not a literary device, then other explanations must be produced, and in general, they are not forthcoming.
Right, it seems very logical. Then we have this intriguing subject of selective or protective anonymity. What's this?
Yeah, this is quite fun. As many readers of the Bible will have noticed, certain characters which are not named in the Gospel of Mark are named in John's Gospel. This becomes particularly apparent when we compare the two arrest and passion narratives. This suggests that John's Gospel was written later than Mark's. Mark covered up the identity of certain people so they would not have trouble with the police. This is known as selective or protective anonymity.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, can you give some examples?
Yeah, the three clearest cases are: 1. The woman anointing Jesus in Bethany. She is mentioned in Mark 14:3 and Matthew 26:7. We do not know her name in either case, but in John 12, verse 3, we learn that she is Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Number 2, the man who cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. He remains anonymous in all three synoptic gospels, that's Mark, Matthew and Luke. But in John 18, verse 10, we learn that it is Simon Peter. And 3, in the same verses in the synoptic gospels, the name of the high priest's servant is not revealed. But in John's gospel, we learn that his name is Malchus, a man of considerable influence. If it had been known that Peter was responsible for his injuries, Simon Peter would have faced criminal charges, hence the anonymity which can be waived later in John's gospel when either Peter is dead or are far away from Jerusalem, or Malchus himself has died.
Yes. Are there any other points of internal evidence that we should mention?
Yeah, from what we've just said, we conclude that John's gospel was written after the last of the synoptic gospels, that is after AD 62. And although it's an argument from silence, the fact that John does not refer to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 suggests that the gospel was written when the Jewish war was well and truly over, say after AD 74 at least.
Right. From the internal evidence, we conclude that the gospel was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. Moreover, the internal evidence strongly suggests that the disciple whom Jesus loved should be identified with John, the son of Zebedee, a member of the 12, a Jewish fisherman from Bethsaida. This is in chapter 1, verse 44, in the Tetrarchy of Philip. He was a young man during the time of Jesus' ministry, and therefore represented no threat to the elites in Jerusalem, although he knew them. This is in chapter 18, verse 16. He could thus also live for a long time after Jesus' ascension, chapter 21 and verse 23. He used his own eyewitness testimony and that of Peter to write his gospel, which had an evangelistic purpose, chapter 20, verse 31. The internal evidence places the writing of the gospel somewhere between AD 74 and AD 130.
Yes, to narrow this down, we must look at the external evidence. Gnostic writers were already quoted from John's Gospel early in the 2nd century AD. However, early Christian apologists such as Justin Martyr, writing between AD 55 and AD 157, also alluded to John's Gospel. Similarly, Justin's disciple Tatian quoted large swathes of John's Gospel in his Diatessaron, a harmony of the Gospels, which was written in about 170 AD. So once again, John's Gospel must have been written before AD 160.
Okay, can we get any closer to the date of writing?
Yep, we can do much better. Papias shows that John's Gospel existed when Papias wrote between AD 100 and 107.
Okay, then we have the evidence from Irenaeus.
Yes, for Irenaeus, the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee, and author of John's Gospel. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had laid upon his breast, did himself publish the Gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. This is clearly a reference to John 13:23, which means the writer of the Gospel was a member of the 12. Irenaeus knew Polycarp personally. Polycarp was intimate with the apostles and was bishop of the church at Smyrna. He was martyred in AD 156 at the age of 86. Irenaeus reports Polycarp's converse with John and the others who had seen the Lord, how he remembered their words and what were the things concerning the Lord which he had heard from them, including his miracles and teaching, and how Polycarp had received from eyewitnesses the word of life and reported all things in agreement with the scriptures. The inference is that Polycarp is referring to John, the son of Zebedee, the author of the fourth gospel.
Yes, Irenaeus' evidence is really, really important.
Too right, Matty. The importance of Irenaeus' witness cannot be overestimated. Irenaeus' sources of information constitute a direct line back to Jesus. He knew Polycarp and would have had information from the churches at Ephesus when he lived nearby in Smyrna. He had a written source, the works of Papias, who was a hearer of John and companion of Polycarp. Irenaeus also refers to those who had been disciples of John and the other apostles or disciples of Jesus who had settled in the area. So these four sources, the church in Ephesus, those who saw John, Polycarp and Papias, converge on Irenaeus, but they go back through John, the apostles, and ultimately to Jesus himself.
That's pretty strong evidence already. Is there any other external evidence?
Oh, yes. Clement of Alexandria and Origen both clearly attribute the fourth gospel to John the disciple. Eusebius resumes things quite well. The beloved disciple of Jesus, John the apostle and evangelist, still surviving, governed the churches in Asia after his return from exile on the island and the death of Domitian. But that he was still living at this time, it may suffice to prove by the testimony of two witnesses, Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. John continued with them until the times of Trajan. He also gives some indication of why John felt he could make a contribution by completing the account of the beginning of Jesus' ministry.
Okay, Peter, let's really try to zero in on the date of writing of John's Gospel.
Right. Okay, here goes. Eusebius states that John died at Ephesus, while Jerome puts John's death in the 68th year of our Lord's Passion, that is in AD 98, just into the reign of Trajan. Hence the Gospel was published no later than AD 98. Now the Roman emperors during this period were Domitian, 81 to 96, Nerva, 96 to 98, and Trajan, 98 to 117. From Irenaeus, we know that John wrote Revelation towards the end of Domitian's reign, say between 93 and 96, and narrowed down to the 15th year of Domitian's reign, that is AD 95 to 96. Nerva became emperor in September 96 and reversed the exiles policy. Clement of Alexandria says that John came from Patmos to Ephesus on the death of Domitian and the accession of Nerva. Tertullian puts it like this: but after Domitian had reigned 15 years and Nerva succeeded to the government, the Roman Senate decreed that the honours of Domitian should be revoked, and that those who had been unjustly expelled should return to their homes and have their goods restored. This is the statement of the historians of the day. It was then also that the Apostle John returned from his banishment on Patmos and took up his abode in Ephesus according to an ancient tradition of the church.
All right, I see. John takes up his abode in Ephesus in AD 96, apparently for the first time on his return from Patmos in AD 96, and dies there, having published his gospel in AD 98. We thus arrive at the straightforward conclusion that John's gospel dates from between AD 96 and 98, and Revelation between AD 95 and 96. And we come to our overall conclusion, which is this, and I summarize. From the internal evidence, it is clear that the gospel was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. Both the internal and external evidence strongly suggests that the disciple whom Jesus loved should be identified with John, the son of Zebedee, a member of the 12, a Jewish fisherman from Bethsaida. This is cited in chapter 1, verse 44, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He was a young man during the time of Jesus' ministry and therefore represented no threat to the elites in Jerusalem, although he knew them. And we know this from chapter 18, verse 16. He could thus also live to a good old age after Jesus' ascension, which is cited in chapter 21, verse 23. He used his own eyewitness testimony and that of Peter to write his gospel, which had an evangelistic purpose. It's chapter 20, verse 31. John probably also wished to complete the account of Jesus' early ministry. So John died in Ephesus in AD 98, just living into the reign of Trajan, who reigned between AD 98 and 117. We have good reason to believe that the gospel was written down while John was still alive, perhaps by Papias himself. A detailed analysis of the external evidence confirms the place of writing is Ephesus and puts the date of writing between AD 96 and AD 98. Is there anything else we should add, Peter?
Well, although this has not been underlined in the above investigation, John's Gospel covers a different time span than the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The other three Gospels cover a period of approximately 18 months, and much of the material concerns Jesus' ministry in Galilee. However, John's Gospel covers a 3-year period with more journeys to Jerusalem and back and more on Jesus' earlier ministry. Thus, John, although he presumably had all three other Gospels at his disposal when he wrote, he didn't try to copy them. Instead, he interacted with them to produce a Gospel to complement them or to fill in the gaps.
And all the Gospel writers had very different profiles.
Yeah, this is interesting because in terms of profession, we have a Gentile physician, Luke, a young Jewish clerk from Jerusalem, Mark, an older Jewish border customs officer from the Galilean countryside, Matthew, and we now had a young Jewish fisherman from the Tetrarchy of Philippi, John. This wide range of backgrounds and professions means that each gospel writer is likely to contribute his own hues and colours because their ways of looking at things are so varied. As regards profiles, we have an inseparable companion of the Apostle Paul, that's Luke, a young man who was like a son to the Apostle Peter as he grew older, that's Mark, and a young man who was very close to Jesus and to Peter in his early days, John. We have 2 members of the original 12 disciples, Matthew and John, and 1 member of the inner 3, John, who went nearly everywhere with Jesus. These are very solid credentials.
They are indeed. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for this excellent explanation. Until next time, and God bless you all.
Yes, God bless you all. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. The podcast Solid Rock was prepared by Peter Murphy and Mate De Brossi. Timothy Bannock helped us with the technical aspects. The music you heard at the beginning and at the end was composed by Benjamin De Brossi. We thank Benjamin and we're using the music with his permission. Thanks again for joining us and please join us again for our next podcasts.